Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. In this episode, I'll be turning a bowl from 600 coloured pencils cast into clear epoxy resin. So without further ado, let's get into it. You join me as I'm putting the finishing touches to the blank. I originally ordered 3 boxes of pencils, but that wasn't quite enough. So here I am adding the last dozen or so from a 4th box. No great difficulty here. I just arranged the pencils so I didn't have too many of the same colour next to one another. I was heading for a total diameter of about 180mm to fit inside the casting bucket. After a quick test fit, I added a few more to fill in the gaps, then I added a few more rubber bands, waxed the casting bucket, and it was ready for the epoxy resin. The resin is from my favoured brand, mixed at a 2:1 ratio. I thought I would need around 2 batches, each one consisting of 150 grams of Part B to 300 grams of Part A, mixed thoroughly as per the manufacturer's recommendations. With the 2 batches mixed, I added them to the casting, only to find out I didn't have enough, so I quickly mixed another batch. To be honest, I could have done with a bit more to totally cover the pencils, but that would have to do. I placed some weight on top and put it into the pressure pot. Then I added the usual 50 to 55 psi. This was then left overnight to cure. It's the next day and it's time to take a look at the blank. This is my first transparent epoxy resin casting and I was keen to see how it had turned out. Apart from a few patches of bubbles in the base and on the top, there were no other visible cracks or voids and the pencils had stayed together. Next I had to remove the exposed ends. I tried sanding them away, but that was a non-starter, so I fixed the blank in the coal jaws and turned them off with a 3/8 bowl gouge. The intention here was to get down to a flat level surface, so I could drill a hole for the woodworm screw. It only took a few passes to remove them, and after that, I drilled the 8mm hole and refixed it to the lathe and began turning. I turned the speed up to around 500 RPM and began removing material. The Easy Wood Tools full-size finisher made easy work of peeling away the resin, but from the start something wasn't right. The blank was slowing down, so I checked to see if the chuck was tight. Then I turned the speed up to see if that would help, but it was still stalling. With the speed turned up, things were a little better, but it still wasn't great. I persevered for a bit longer till I realised what was happening. The woodworm screw wasn't gripping, allowing the blank to slip. I considered using a faceplate ring, but I wasn't confident the screws would hold. I turned my attention to what would be the base, removing resin until I had the pencils fully exposed. Then I turned the blank around and fixed it in the coal jaws, with the tailstock holding it securely in place. That was much better. With no more slipping, I could set to removing the waste material. I wanted to keep the blank as big as possible, so I continued until the pencils began to emerge from the resin. The first thing that struck me was how rough the pencils were cutting. The carbide was basically tearing them apart. I tried taking lighter cuts, which helped, but another thing I noticed was how patchy the colours were against the large sections of wood. To get around this, I decided to make the side of the bowl curvy, so it would cut through a few layers of colour. With most of the outer layer of resin removed, I switched to a 3/8 bowl gouge to see if that would cut the pencils any better, but there wasn't that much improvement, and the resin was really tough to cut through. I continued with a few more cuts, and eventually I cut away the last bits of resin, revealing a continuous mass of pencils. A bit more shear scraping, and then I could begin shaping the bowl. To include as many curves as possible into the final design, I decided early on that this would be a pedestal bowl. I also thought about cutting the top section off to create a lid, but with this being my first go at a pencil blank, I erred on the side of caution and stuck to it just being an open bowl. Using the bowl gouge, I began forming the pedestal. I worked down either side of the cutout, being careful not to get a catch on the opposite side. I wasn't sure how deep to make the cutout. This part would be taking a lot of stress when I started to hollow out, and I had no idea how strong this blank would be. I made a few more cuts and decided I would make it deeper, if required, when I worked on the base. Next, I formed a pinched middle section to add more curves and to cut through another couple of layers of pencils. For this, I used the bowl gouge, again working from either side, though this is much wider and not as deep, so no chance of a catch. A final bit of shaping, shear scraping with a bowl gouge, I blended and faired the curves, then I sanded from 80 to 400 grit. After sanding, I could see that a few of the coloured bits had fallen out of the pencils, leaving shallow voids, so off camera I filled them with black Star Bond and power sanded them smooth. Now I could apply the finish. I first cleaned down with denatured alcohol, then I applied 2 coats of a shellac-based sanding sealer, each one denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire grit, a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then wood wax 22, just one coat, buffed away with more paper towel to leave a deep sheen. It was quite cold, so the paper towel clogged up on the surface and had to be picked off, but that done, it was time to hollow out. I used the Easy Wood Tools mid-size finisher to begin with. I felt this would put less stress on the blank, as I was still unsure how strong the base section would be, though I needn't have worried. The carbide turned the pencils and resin into a dust-like consistency, and I soon switched to the full-size carbide. Very quickly the carbide got down to roughly the depth I was looking for, and to get better access to the side of the bowl, I used a side-cutting bowl scraper. This was incredibly aggressive at removing the waste, and I had to be careful not to take too much off. I continued removing material with a side-cutting scraper. I was aiming for a wall thickness of around half an inch or 13mm. I also used it to finalise the depth of the bowl before cleaning up the rim with a bowl gouge. Then it was time to remove the centre support. I've never been confident with just cold jaws on their own without the tailstock, so I left this to the very last minute. With that out of the way, I used the carbide cutter to remove the ridges and smooth the base into the side, being careful to apply pressure towards the base so I didn't lever the workpiece off the lathe. Then I sanded from 80 to 400 grit, after which I applied the finish, same as before, which I'll fast forward through because you've already seen it. After picking a few more bits of paper off the surface, there was just the base to do. I turned the bowl round and fixed it in the cold jaws with the tailstock for added support, and I set to thinning the base down. There was a thick layer of resin to get through before I got to the pencils. The tool of choice here was the bowl gouge. I wanted more of a cutting action to remove the material rather than scrape it with carbide and risk knocking a chunk out of the side of the base. With the base down to the required thickness, the edge needed a bit of attention to clean it up, then I could remove the last little bit in the centre, and then it was time for sanding from 80 to 400 grit. Sanding done, I applied the finish, same as before. I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, then applied sanding sealer, followed by Yorkshire grit, and to finish, wood wax 22. And that's it, another project finished, and I think this one is a success. The pencil and resin blank certainly presented some challenges with work holding, and if I do another one, I'll use a solid wooden core to cure that problem. But that aside, the colours look great, and for me the curves cutting through the layers really made this piece. I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, it will really help the channel out. A thumbs up will be great, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.